Hello, my name is Renata McAllister, and I will be presenting to you today on the impact of self-view in virtual settings. We will really start to analyze and look at what the data says about what self-perception um, does and how it's impacted in our digital communication, specifically related to virtual communication. So our first item of business is to just go over what we're going to talk about. We're going to start with an introduction, and I'll introduce you to the research question. And then we're going to move into some of the theoretical foundations, and then what the research says, including aesthetic concerns that have come up and something called the Zoom effect. And then we're going to talk about fatigue, virtual meeting fatigue, standards that people have, and what the biblical perspective is on all of this, on self-work, on coping strategies, and any future research directions that this type of work could go toward. So as we know, the rise of virtual meetings and video conferencing really ramped up during COVID, but it's transformed how we communicate. And understanding how adding self-view affects individuals in these virtual settings could be a critical component for enhancing well-being and productivity and creating a workspace that provides safety for employees. So, all right, virtual meetings and video conferencing trends. We know that there's been a global shift, right? And we rely now with remote work and online education, that video conferencing is a big piece of that. It's led to a huge increase and it's become a staple in our personal and professional communication. So Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meet, they've really just become essential to the way that we now work. And it starts to raise an important question about how it can influence individuals, how we perceive ourselves and our images in a professional context, and how the prevalence of these video meetings can have some psychological impacts. And so we look at, are there stressors or any impacts to social interaction? So specifically, what happens to people when they're constantly using the self-view feature during meetings all day? Now, what do I mean by self-view? So if you're in a video conferencing setting, most platforms have the option to hide the little video of you so that when you're speaking to another person, you will only see their video, or if you're in a room full of people, you won't see your own face. But what happens when we don't do that? So the research question is, what is the impact of self-view during video conferencing in virtual settings? And so what we'll see in the coming slides is that this can impact our individual satisfaction with ourselves, self-esteem, and potentially professional dynamics. And so understanding all of this can reveal some insights into how employees may be addressing well-being, right? It can change perceptions or increase perceptions about oneself. And so we're going to look at what the research says. So before we get started on all that, we're just going to take a look at a couple different theoretical foundations to provide a little framework for what we're talking about. So in 1954, Festinger talked about the social comparison theory. And of course, since then, there's been a lot that's been built onto it. But basically, this theory suggests that individuals begin to determine their self-worth by comparing themselves to other people. So in virtual settings, this can lead to heightened self-awareness and potentially dissatisfaction. So individuals evaluate themselves by comparing their appearance to other people and their behavior to other people. So self-view in video could amplify these self-comparisons because you're able to look at yourself and another person. So the social comparison theory, again, begins to examine how individuals determine their own social and personal worth based on how they stack up to the people around them. And so how does this look in a virtual setting, right? This is something that's been studied for a long time, but when individuals maybe perceive themselves as less attractive or less confident compared to others, dissatisfaction, self-consciousness rises. It can contribute to anxiety, and in professional or social settings, demeanor and appearance can be scrutinized, and it can lead to a lot of self-scrutiny, right? Which we know also from additional research does not always lead to positive results. And so this is one of the foundational pieces that the research question is built on. Okay, so we know that people are measuring themselves against each other. What does that look like in a virtual setting? So then there is something called self-objectification theory. And so Fredrickson and Roberts in 1997 took a look at how women and individuals, specifically women, might internalize an observer's perspective on their bodies, which leads to self-objectification. So this idea says that we can internalize how others perceive us and our bodies, and that can impact our self-image and our behavior into self-objectification. And so this, of course, could lead to anxiety or decreased self-esteem, because in video conferencing, of course, it's very easy to focus on oneself for extended periods of time, and it could lead to more self-objectification, right? So these are two foundational theoretical pieces to think about as we have now moved into the virtual space. These studies, of course, are very old in terms of research, but they lay the groundwork for what we're talking about. So the first study that we're going to look at talks about aesthetic concerns and self-view. So the research here is indicating that self-view can significantly influence perceptions of self, and it often leads to dissatisfaction and negative feelings. So in this research, the researchers, Al-Multairi and others, examined how self-view increases aesthetic dissatisfaction. So the study revealed that heightened self-focus during calls led to greater dissatisfaction about one's appearance, and that increased self-focus contributed to negative self-assessment, and that overall affected self-esteem and confidence. So 85.4% of the participants reported disliking at least one facial feature after prolonged video conferencing. and that we know, as I just mentioned, that higher self-focus, so the more they focused on themselves, the lower satisfaction they had. So this implies that frequent self-monitoring during video calls could contribute to negative self-perception, right? So a large majority of these participants expressed their negative feelings about their self-image during video calls, with a really significant impact on their self-esteem. So they also identified common disliked features, and it became something that you could predict, right? That it was the wrinkles or the neck or something like that, that they were able to identify the different pieces or the different parts of themselves that they were really scrutinizing. And so that is one of the first studies that we'll look at today. And then the next one we have here is something called the Zoom effect, which you may have heard of before, but it emphasizes how video calls can really exacerbate some underlying issues that we might already have. And so video calls, according to PICOS and others in their 2021 study, found through their research that the video calls can increase dysmorphic concerns. So what does that mean? So PICOS and others focused on how video calls during the COVID-19 pandemic impacted body image and interest in aesthetic or cosmetic procedures. So they looked at whether video conferencing was connected to focusing on oneself more, identifying new issues with one's appearance. They also looked at any engaging in sort of video manipulation or using filters, and then of course desiring cosmetic procedures because of that. So the research indicates that video calls can really intensify appearance-related anxiety, and this leads to increased dysmorphic concerns among the participants. So again, higher self-focus during video calls was correlated with an increased desire for cosmetic enhancements. And so this is a psychological implication, right, of the self-view function during video calls. People who, in this study, who were frequently engaged in video calls were more likely to experience self-consciousness. And again, that self-focus led to more dysmorphic concerns, and oftentimes video manipulation also did correlate with body dissatisfaction. So again, here we're seeing that this self-focus can create some psychological issues, maybe because of there's an overemphasis on the perceived flaws because of the constant self-viewing, and it can increase that social anxiety in virtual meetings. So this is an interesting subject because we as IO psychologists have an interest in the well-being of workers. And so what does this mean, right? Well, virtual meeting fatigue is another research topic related to this. That's a common experience, and it can be linked to self-view and those associated concerns. So Rattan and others in 2022 examined the relationship between facial dissatisfaction and virtual meeting fatigue, and how race, gender, and ethnicity play a role. And so this study highlights the connection between facial dissatisfaction, heightened feelings of fatigue associated with video conferencing, frequent video conferencing, and video meeting fatigue was looked at between different genders, different between men and women, and they found that fatigue is higher in women than in men, and more for people of color than the white participants. And it's been the video meeting fatigue has been correlated to extensive self-video exposure, which can cause, according to these researchers, or mimic mirror anxiety and self-objectification. There's that word again, self-objectification. So this study revealed that the facial dissatisfaction is linked to increased feelings of fatigue during video calls, which is an interesting link, right? Because we know about video fatigue, right? But adding that element of self-view, self-scrutiny, and facial dissatisfaction, it increases the cognitive load, right, on the employee. So again, women and Asian participants reported higher fatigue, and facial dissatisfaction was a significant predictor of Zoom fatigue. So reducing self-view reported exhaustion and improvement, reducing self-view reduced reported exhaustion and improved engagement in virtual meetings. So when the self-view was reduced, exhaustion went down, engagement went up. And so this implies that the psychological strain of the video conferencing or self-view could be mitigated by turning off self-view, right? Or organizations should at least consider allowing options to disable that function within their platform. So another interesting study here. So then there was a professor, Jeremy Beilenson, from the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab, and he looked at the psychological consequences of spending hours a day on the platforms and found 4 reasons for the Zoom fatigue. And the reasons that he identified were excessive close-up eye contact, which could create unnatural levels of intimacy, seeing oneself constantly, which is what we're talking about, leading to increased self-evaluation and stress, limited mobility, of course, right? Like we're in one spot all day, and higher cognitive load, because interpreting nonverbal cues on screen is more mentally taxing than face-to-face with a person in the room. So the 4th study, Zoom dysmorphia and professional trends. So Zoom dysmorphia raises concerns about professional interactions and decisions. So you'll see here that Rice and others in their 2021 study, they researched the impact of video conferencing on self-perception and cosmetic treatments again. So in a similar type of study. But these authors explore what they call Zoom dysmorphia, which is extended periods of self-viewing on video calls leading to dissatisfaction with one's appearance. So there it is in a nice little nutshell what we're talking about today. This research indicated that there were a notable increase, an uptick in requests for cosmetic consultations with the rise of video calls, and with that increased self-scrutiny. So especially during COVID, the rise of requests for cosmetic procedures went up, and they were specific about what they were looking for, right? Of course, fillers, lasers, Botox, those were things that were most common and requested. And so Rice and others, they talked to dermatologists and looked at their perspectives on the rise of these cosmetic consultations. And they found that there was a surge in patients seeking these enhancements because of virtual meetings, the self-view in virtual meetings. And they expressed concern with dissatisfaction with facial symmetry, with wrinkles, with skin texture. And it's related to pre-existing social media concerns about looking at oneself and having these unattainable beauty standards that are due to so many things, right? But the workplace impact for this is that professionals feel really pressure to enhance their performance or their appearance, especially when you're engaging with those client-facing roles. And this is what they get to see. You know, this is all they're getting to see the whole time they're with you, right? So this, of course, puts pressure during video calls and on people, and can certainly impact self-esteem and confidence. And so it's important to, I think, develop some coping strategies to deal with the pressure that comes from this, from the idea that we have to maintain appearances, and that impacts our professional reputation and our relationship dynamics and so on. So this can create a larger amount of stress for people. All right, so camera usage, workplace impact, study number 4. Shockley and others in 2029 looked at 119 full-time remote employees, and they did a within-person field experiment, which was different than the other research that I looked at. This was an experiment research, and they determined the impact of camera use during virtual meetings, and the specific focus was on employee engagement and fatigue. And so they really wanted to understand whether the use of cameras would contribute to more fatigue and influence employee participation and engagement within meetings. And so that is what they looked at. What do you think they found? Well, here it is. They found that camera use increases fatigue, which reduces participation and engagement, and that women experienced higher fatigue than men. But when they looked at tenure, that did not significantly impact the results. So this Shockley and others really determined that, you know, organizations should adopt a flexible camera policy, right? To be mindful of there are some disparities, right? Because the fatigue is more with new employees and with women, and it can impact engagement or being seen or heard during meetings and within your spot on the team and within your engagement. So we don't. I think this perspective of what we're talking about, the self-view camera, it's not widely researched. It's not known really well within the research. I think that there's a lot of research that points to how cameras are really great and how it connects us together and how it's important for all of us to use our cameras. And that's actually not the argument that we're making, right? So when we look at this student perspective, and I will not be able to say this name without saying it incorrectly, so I will attempt one time. Sederevichiuti and Pasia Uskiene in 2022 looked at social presence theory to explore the perception of students in relation to using video during their distance learning sessions. And so these researchers suggest that social presence theory plays a role, right, in the audio and visual aspects of engaging online, and that it can, you know, having your video and audio on leads to significant engagement and communication. But does it do anything else, right? We know that it creates building trust, and it helps people to bond. And so the literature supports that in online learning situations, that it can create or influence motivation in the perception of others. And so this visibility that happens for others is important. But again, that's not what we are looking at for this research question. However, it's connected. So video enhances engagement and trust, but it can negatively impact the feelings of privacy and increase fatigue. So visibility in online learning situations influences motivations and perceptions of peers. However, it increases fatigue. It lowers the feeling of comfort. It lowers the feeling of privacy, which we know from the research we just looked at. When the fatigue goes up, that's also connected to having all of these issues around self-dissatisfaction, self-scrutiny, and some really damaging effects. So the camera, of course, we know goes two ways, right? You can see me and I can see me, right? So the part we're talking about is I can see me. We're not saying don't use video altogether, but the self view is a really important piece. So what does the Bible say about all this, right? The Bible can help us really create a foundation to understand what our self-worth is, but beyond external appearances. And so I focus on this one, right? Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. I think it's so easy to get caught up in this. And it's very clear, you know, what the Bible says, where our worth comes from. It's not from our charm and our beauty, right? It's transient. Beauty is transient. And so inner worth and character are things to develop over time. And so focusing on that and moving away from the appearance and the self-scrutiny is one way to connect back to biblical truths and faith, because, you know, true value lies in our inner qualities rather than our external appearances, because those, again, are fleeting, right? It's temporary, it can change. We know that the Lord looks at the heart, right? The scripture emphasizes the importance of our inner qualities over our outward appearances, and that true value is what's inside, right? Not just our external attributes, which of course, you know, when we're talking about leadership, that's important. There's behaviors that are associated with that too, but really looking at the heart, it helps us to look at our own heart beyond our own surface judgments of ourselves, and maybe cultivate a sense of appreciation for who we are and what we offer the world. It's not about looking in your camera. So some coping strategies to think about in these self-view virtual settings. Hide your self-view. I've been getting in the habit of this regularly. As soon as I come onto a meeting, I hit my 3 dots on Teams, hide self, and guess what? I feel more engaged with the people in the room. It really just enhances my focus on who I am meeting with, and it does reduce my self-consciousness. I can tell you that the reason I decided to do this research is personal, right? I started a remote role 3 years ago, and since then I have become increasingly more interested in how to, you know, adjust how I look on screen. And I never cared about that before. I would just come to work, be present, be with people, and I started to think, oh my goodness, well, I need to make sure that all of this is exactly what I want other people to see. And then I would start looking at myself to make sure that I measured up. And oftentimes, it just didn't add up. I didn't measure up to my own standards. So again, going back to our worth is in our heart, our true value, right? And connecting back with, oh, that's right, that's what matters, right? So to reduce self-consciousness, you can push the hide button, and it does improve communication because I'm actually looking at the other person. Again, a coping strategy, focus on faith, foster acceptance and worthiness. So I'm sure you've heard of mindfulness, and for me that's really about just taking a moment, being present and being aware of the thoughts going through my head, and so fostering self-acceptance through mindfulness can help cultivate a more positive view, right? And connect back with faith, right? Make sure you're reading the scripture that reminds you where the Lord sees you and how the Lord sees you. And so prayer, meditation, and then of course the practical step of hiding your self-view can all play a role. For organizations, of course, this is allowing your members to have that option, right? We're not saying turn off your camera, we're saying turn off self-view. So where could the future research go for this? Well, of course, longitudinal studies, right? So what we need to see is more research over time about how self-perception evolves with the increased exposure to virtual interactions. There are not a lot of research studies on perceptions from another person based on me having hidden my view, right? Do I seem more present to you when my view is hidden? There's not a lot of research on that. And really being able to understand our social presence, right? So we talked about social presence theory, which of course talks a lot about how I'm perceived as being present within the use of digital media or any media at all. And so what is our social presence like when we hide that self-view is another way for studies moving into the future. And so another thing to consider in terms of research and looking at workplace policies is to look at what are the psychological effects, right? More research within organizations. Two of the research studies were done about cosmetic procedures, but what are we looking at? How could we move that into a workspace? And how do we promote healthier practices during video calls to improve employee well-being and productivity, right? And if these things need to, let's adapt the policies. Let's make some recommendations. So in conclusion, of course, our research question going way back, what is the impact of self-view during video conferencing in virtual settings? And so what we learned is that increased self-focus leads to heightened self-criticism and dissatisfaction. And so self-view can lead to greater self-objectification and dissatisfaction with our appearances. The Zoom effect was linked to increased dysmorphic concerns, higher rates of cosmetic consultations, asking for procedures, and that these things affect disproportionately women and Asian participants who were in the studies. And so this also, self-view can contribute to Zoom fatigue, right? We learned about Zoom fatigue. We learned that there's 4 things that were identified that lead to Zoom fatigue. One of them, of course, is seeing oneself on screen constantly. And so it can create more exhaustion, lower engagement, more stress, especially among new employees and women. Again, some more research, of course, identifying that self-view can increase stress, self-consciousness, anxiety, poor mental health and well-being with remote workers. And so we can help with this, right? We also learned that there are workplace and social implications, that there's an increased pressure to engage and look professional on video calls, and that this also has contributed to a rising demand in requests for consultations for cosmetic procedures and interventions. And so looking at, camera usage, self-view versus employee well-being, this is a big discussion that should be happening within organizations. And so what are some of the coping strategies that we talked about? Turn your self-view off, right? It might be hard at first, right? But it reduces self-objectification, it reduces fatigue, it reduces self-scrutiny, which can thereby increase engagement. And so with this, if there are any areas where workplace policy could be adjusted, let's do that. Let's do that. And so we can also begin to shift our orientation from aesthetics to presence, right? Instead of what do I look like, it's how can I be here with you? And then, of course, relying on our faith and knowing that the truth is in here. Future research, we talked about longitudinal studies, long-term psychological impact of some of these issues around self-view and virtual settings. We could look at even different cultural contexts around self-view and how it could be tailored to accommodate different cultures, different personality types, different coping strategies. So overall, the evidence that was looked at for this research supports that self-view can have a negative psychological impact, a negative emotional impact, and can impact how we show up professionally. And this is especially in terms of self-objectification, concerns about our appearance, meeting fatigue, mental health strain, and engagement. And so individuals and organizations really should look at what their coping strategy is to mitigate this, right? To lower some maybe pre-existing issues around dysmorphia and other problems. And so future research can help to move us forward by looking at some of these topics. And there may be more that we have not even discovered yet around this. And who knows, with virtual reality, what could be coming next. So thank you so much for joining me today in our discovery around self-view during virtual video conferencing. I hope you enjoyed the session. Here are my references for the paper, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much. Have a great day.